Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. The rain started earlier than expected, without thunder, without warning. It crept into Eden Ridge like a thief at twilight, soft and heavy. Not the kind of rain that lashes at windows, but the type that settles on the soul. Miriam Alden stood by the window of her quiet home on Briar Lane, watching the droplets trail slowly down the glass like tired travelers returning from a long journey. Her hands, worn but graceful, worked steadily at slicing apples for the pie cooling on the counter. She had risen early that morning, long before the roosters even remembered their duty. Guided by a quiet kind of joy, Harrison would be home by dusk. 2 weeks in Norwich, he'd said. Meetings, boardrooms, wine-laced dinners with foreign clients. The kind of world Miriam never envied. She liked her corner of the world tidy and true, with casseroles on Sundays and hymnals echoing faintly through her kitchen radio. The house was warm with the scent of rosemary and baked lamb, the same meal she'd made for their anniversary 3 years ago when they laughed without forcing it. But laughter had since grown scarce, slipping between them like lost coins down a storm drain. Yet still she waited, pressing her hope into each task, ironing his shirts, fluffing the pillows, checking the porch light twice. Hope is a strange thing. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hums quietly under your skin, keeping you upright when reason has long since sat down. As the grandfather clock marked 3 with a gentle chime, she adjusted the hem of her cardigan, the blue one with tiny pearl buttons, the same one Harrison once said made her eyes look like evening skies. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. Time had kissed her gently but not kindly. A few silver strands framed her temples like frost along an old fence, and her eyes, once filled with sun, now seemed like lakes that had forgotten how to sparkle. But she smiled at herself all the same, the kind of smile only a woman familiar with long silences can manage. She stepped outside briefly, the basket of fresh herbs tucked under her arm when the rain caught her in its arms. Not violently, not cruelly, just enough to remind her who was in charge. She laughed softly, almost like an apology, and turned back toward the house, her shoes leaving faint prints on the gravel path. She would dry them later. For now there was still so much to finish. And yet, beneath all her movement, beneath the folding and seasoning and arranging, there was a faint tremor inside her. Something unsaid, something uninvited, like a verse half remembered from a childhood sermon. Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Galatians 6 verse 7. She had no reason to think of it now. And yet it came. Like dust caught in sunlight, the thought hovered, weightless but inignorable. By the time she returned to the porch, the drizzle had softened into mist, cloaking the trees like forgotten prayers. Miriam hesitated at the door, the brass knob cold against her hand. Something inside her hesitated too, not fear, not suspicion, but a strange hush in her bones. She turned the key slowly, her heartbeat steady but alert. The house should have been quiet. It should have smelled like home, like cinnamon and lavender, like bread rising on the sill. But what she heard was a melody, light, cheerful, off-key. A young woman's voice hummed something unfamiliar in the living room. Miriam's brows knit together gently. She stepped further in, careful not to let the door creak. She didn't speak, didn't call out. A draft moved past her like breath from an open mouth. She followed the hum, each step slower than the last, and then she saw her. A woman, young, barefoot, wearing an apron that Miriam hadn't seen in months, standing on a step stool, painting over the pale mint green wall with a bold, sunny coral, a stranger in her house, not a visitor, no. This woman moved with the comfort of ownership, not permission. She danced slightly to the rhythm of her own voice, oblivious. Then came the voice from the speakerphone on the side table. I love how you're making it yours, Harrison said, chuckling warmly. I've hated that old wall color for years. The woman laughed in response, dipping her brush again. Miriam's stomach dropped like an anchor. The paintbrush moved across her memories, covering not just paint, but every quiet moment she'd ever preserved like a pressed flower in that room. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. Instead she watched. Her eyes didn't blink, Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for words that had no shape yet. Lydia, that was her name, it seemed. The woman spoke into the phone as though they'd done this many times before. She talked about new curtains she'd ordered, a rug arriving next week, and something about finally making it feel like home. Miriam's hand stayed at her sides, still, her knuckles pale. There are moments when betrayal doesn't need a confrontation. Its voice is loud enough in the silence. And there it was, the silence that says more than thunder ever could. She stepped backward, carefully, as if afraid to break something invisible. The hallway seemed longer now, the walls unfamiliar. She walked out of her own house like someone leaving a stranger's funeral. The rain welcomed her again, soft and wet, running down her cheeks like tears borrowed from heaven. And Miriam kept walking through the garden, down Briar Lane, past the bakery, the chapel, the old bookstore where they'd first held hands. She walked not because she had somewhere to go, but because staying would have meant unraveling. And some threads, once pulled, never find their way back into the fabric. She passed by a girl skipping stones by the river and nodded politely, her lips curled into a half smile as though she were simply out for a stroll. No one would know, no one would suspect. That's the trick with quiet women, the louder the pain, the gentler their retreat. And in that moment under the soft weeping sky, Miriam Alden, wife or homemaker, Billy dreamer, became something else entirely. Something that even the heavens paused to notice. The sky held no stars that night, only the murky grey of heavy clouds, as Miriam walked with no destination, her shoes soaked through and her cardigan clinging to her like a child unwilling to be left behind. The streets of Edenridge were quiet, and rightly so. It was the kind of night where even the dogs didn't bark, and the wind moved only to mind its own business. She didn't carry an umbrella. She didn't check the time. She walked with the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prepare for. Each step echoed faintly against the cobblestones, as if the town was whispering its sympathy. No one saw her leave, no one called her name. The world didn't stop, and she didn't expect it to. Her heart, however, throbbed like a cracked bell, slow, uneven, unsure if it was sounding the end of something or the beginning of something else. She passed the Alden family church, where lilies always bloomed a month too early, and only for a moment. The stained glass glowed faintly from within, but she didn't go inside. Faith, after all, doesn't always live inside buildings. Sometimes it walks with you barefoot in the dark. Her father once told her that. He had long since gone to glory, but his voice came back to her now, like wind beneath a closed door. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Exodus 15 verse 3. Her battle had no armies, no swords, only silence, and the soft betrayal of being forgotten while still alive. By the time she reached the edge of town, the rain had gentled into a thin mist that hung in the air like held breath. The Willow Inn sat beneath two old sycamore trees, their twisted limbs like the arthritic hands of widows pointing to heaven. The inn wasn't grand, 3 rooms upstairs, lace curtains in every window, and a bell above the door that chimed like a lullaby when opened. Dottie, the innkeeper, was a woman who never asked questions with her mouth, only with her eyes. She took one look at Miriam's drenched figure and opened the door wider, stepping aside without a word. Miriam offered no explanations. She didn't have to. Some pain hangs around the body like smoke, faint, clinging, undeniable. Dottie handed her a towel, the same one with the embroidered corner from years ago when Miriam taught the women's Bible class on Wednesdays. It still smelled like lavender and iron linen. The room upstairs was warm but modest, a single bed, a quilt with fading roses, and a chair beside the window. Miriam sank into that chair like someone placing herself gently into memory. She opened the window just a crack, enough to hear the sound of the sycamores brushing against the walls like old friends whispering secrets. For the first time in hours, she exhaled without trembling. In her mind, the image of Lydia in her apron refused to fade. It clung to her like wet wool, but Miriam didn't curse, didn't rehearse arguments in her head. She simply sat there, breathing slow, like she had to remember how. She stayed at the inn without counting days, as though time had slipped into the river and drifted downstream. Each morning she rose before dawn, washed her face in cold water, and tied her hair back in the quiet way of women who've chosen not to be noticed. Her hands, though idle in the chores of a house now lost, still moved with purpose. She began writing in an old leather notebook she found in the drawer beside the bed. It had belonged to another guest years ago, someone who had forgotten it or perhaps meant to leave it behind. Miriam used the remaining blank pages not to record the past, but to understand it. She wrote with a steadiness that surprised her. Not love letters, not prayers of complaint, just reflections. Lines about her mother's hands, her father's tobacco pipe, the way Harrison used to run his fingers along her collarbone before they became strangers sleeping on the same mattress. Her words weren't bitter, but they were honest. "I think I forgot how to speak in my own house," she wrote one afternoon. "I think I learned to survive in the silence by becoming smaller." The Bible beside her bed fell open one day to Ecclesiastes 3, as by some unseen hand, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. She let the words sit in her lap like a stone warming in the sun. Outside, the town moved on. The world didn't know it had lost a woman like Miriam. That was the thing about quiet women. They disappeared without dragging furniture behind them. It was in the bookshop down the hill that she saw Samuel again. She hadn't planned to go inside, but the scent of old paper and pine resin greeted her as she passed, and her feet made the decision her heart was too slow to catch. Samuel was stacking volumes of poetry on a shelf labeled Unloved Words. He turned when he saw her, surprise softening his eyes. He didn't rush toward her, didn't ask where she had been. He simply offered a nod and gestured toward the reading chair by the stove. Miriam took it. Their conversation was sparse at first, shared thoughts about Keats, the weather, the wisdom of letting books go out of print. But silence sat with them like a polite friend, never awkward. He didn't ask about Harrison, didn't ask about her sudden absence from Sunday service. Instead, he slid a small book across the counter a few days later, with a paper tucked inside that read, "If you're looking for your voice, sometimes someone else's words can show you the road." It was a book of Psalms, not the kind she had underlined as a girl, but the kind that felt like salve when rubbed raw. "The Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon him, to all that call upon him in truth." Psalm 145 verse 18. Miriam didn't reply, but she came back the next day, and the next, until her presence became part of the rhythm of the shop, like the ticking of the old wall clock, or the way the light hit the window at 4 o'clock. She had not healed, she was not whole, but she had started again, and sometimes that was enough. The morning crept in like an old friend, unsure if it was still welcome. Miriam opened her eyes slowly, as if she'd been underwater and finally surfaced for air. The room was bathed in pale blue, the kind of light that came just before sunrise when the world hadn't quite woken up, but wasn't entirely asleep either. The lace curtains swayed with the soft breath of wind, and the scent of fresh bread drifted in from the kitchen downstairs. She lay still, listening to the house settle around her. There were no clocks ticking here, no heavy footsteps pacing the hallway. The inn didn't know the rhythm of heartbreak. It only knew how to cradle those who came bearing burdens too heavy for words. Miriam turned to her side, gazing at the empty chair by the window. She had left her cardigan there the night before, draped neatly like an old habit refusing to be discarded. There was no urgency in her bones, no list of chores clanging in her mind. For the first time in many years, she wasn't waiting on anyone's return. She rose slowly, the wooden floorboards cool beneath her bare feet. Outside, the trees stood like sentinels, dripping quietly with the remains of the night's mist. Her hands reached for the Bible on the side table, not from habit, but from hunger. It fell open to Isaiah 43 verse 2, and her eyes lingered on the verse. "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee." There was no thunder in her chest, only the slow realization that God had walked beside her, not ahead or behind, but beside. She began each day the same after that, sitting by the window in her thin cotton robe, sipping tea steeped in silence. Her journal, already halfway filled with words she didn't think she had, now lay open each morning before the sun was fully risen. Some days she wrote letters she never sent. Other days she scribbled verses and half-formed prayers. One entry simply read, "I was a home before I ever built one." And with that, the pen paused as though it too needed to sit with the truth a while. Her writing had no audience, no purpose beyond release. Words had always lived inside her, but they had been buried beneath years of politeness, of choosing the soft answer, of folding disappointment into casseroles and polite nods. Now they rose like bread in the heat of honesty. Dottie never asked what she wrote, nor why she stayed so long. She only made sure the teapot was always full and the bed always made. It was a soft kind of love, the kind that asked for nothing but presence. Edenridge moved on just beyond the inn's stone wall, school children running late, a shop window changing with the season, someone's rooster crowing as if announcing things that didn't concern Miriam anymore. She had become an observer of her own town, watching from behind glass like someone learning a new language by listening to familiar words said differently. Her grief had shape now. It was no longer a fog but a slow-turning windmill, spinning quietly in the distance of her mind. One Sunday morning, the sound of music floated in through the open window, hymns from the small chapel she had passed the night she left her house. The notes came soft but steady, like a mother rocking a child. Miriam didn't move from her chair. She closed her eyes and let the melody wash over her. It was Come Thou Fount, a hymn she had once taught the choir children to sing in rounds. Her voice hadn't sung in months, not in church, not in the kitchen, not even in the shower. But now, without warning, a note escaped her lips, then another. And soon she was singing softly, brokenly, as if each word came from a part of her body that had only just remembered how to feel. She cried while singing, not a sobbing, shaking cry, but a quiet weeping that wet her cheeks like dew and disappeared into the folds of her robe. There was no one to hear it but the wind and the sparrows outside her window. The pain did not vanish, but it shifted, like ice beginning to melt the corners. She thought of Lydia, not with hatred, but with a strange detachment, as though remembering a name from a dream. Miriam had no desire to return to the house, not because she feared confrontation, but because it no longer called her. The memories she had left behind there were already packing their things. Her home, she was slowly realizing, had always been wherever she could breathe without shrinking. The day she walked down to the edge of the river, the sky was clear and full of light, like heaven had opened a window just for her. She sat on the bench beneath the old iron bridge where wildflowers had begun to bloom without asking anyone's permission. Miriam watched the water slip past, each ripple a whisper in motion. She pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket, one she had written but never mailed. Addressed to Harrison, the paper had softened at the edges from being read too many times. She didn't open it. She had memorized every word. Instead, she placed it on the bench beside her and let the breeze have it. She watched the letter drift, then tumble onto the path before the wind carried it off, like a bird finally remembering it had wings. There were no spectators, no grand farewell. Just a woman at peace with what she could not reclaim. She stayed there until the sun slid low in the sky and the shadows grew long and graceful. Before leaving, she dipped her fingers into the river and whispered a verse she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Psalm 51 verse 10. And with that, she stood and walked back toward the inn, not to wait to plan, but to continue. Because sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is not to confront what hurt her, but to outgrow it without asking for permission. It was the stillness that startled her first, the kind of hush that doesn't arrive naturally in a place once familiar. Miriam had not walked the full length of Briar Lane since the night she left. The trees that lined the street had shed their spring flowers, and now the ground was scattered with browning petals and small twigs, like remnants of a party no one remembered attending. Her steps were slow, not because her legs were tired, but because her soul walked with caution. Time doesn't erase betrayal, but it softens the sharp corners of memory. She kept to the side of the road, her body half shadowed by the afternoon sun, as if she didn't want the day to fully recognize her. The wind moved around her gently, stirring her coat as though even it was unsure of what to do with her presence. When she turned the corner, the house came into view. It stood just as it always had, white shutters, clay roof tiles, a crooked gutter that Harrison had always said he would fix. But something about it looked smaller now. Not physically, but in presence. It no longer loomed in her mind the way it once had. It looked like a house, nothing more, nothing less. She paused at the gate, her fingers brushing against the iron latch that had once clicked shut behind her on evenings when she returned from the market. She didn't open it. Instead, she stood there watching quietly, like someone reading the final page of a book she had once loved but could no longer recommend. Children's laughter broke through the stillness, and her eyes shifted to the side garden, the one she had planted with hydrangeas that never quite took. Now where her careful lines once were, a little girl in pigtails skipped around wild poppies, chasing a red rubber ball with stubby legs and the fearlessness of someone whose world had never been broken. Miriam's gaze lingered on the girl. She had Lydia's coloring, no doubt, light-skinned dark curls, and a mischievous smile that made her nose wrinkle slightly. A child born before betrayal but now raised in its shadow. And yet she looked happy, genuinely, freely happy. That hurt more than Miriam expected. Not out of envy, but out of the recognition that a new life had taken root where hers had once stood. She looked toward the porch and saw him, Harrison, kneeling near the roses with a hose in hand, spraying water with the same casualness he used when rinsing paint off his hands after finishing the shed. He looked older now. Not dramatically, but enough for her to see what she hadn't before. The slouch in his back, the sag around his eyes, the way he leaned on one knee more than the other. There was no music playing, no calls into the house, just the sound of water and the quiet collapse of years gone wrong. He glanced up, perhaps to greet the child, perhaps to check the sky, and that's when his eyes met hers. The hose dropped from his fingers, and water puddled at his feet, creeping toward the porch like it, too, was searching for an exit. He didn't speak right away. For a full moment, both stood frozen on opposite sides of the fence, two people with too much history and nowhere left to put it. The air between them didn't hum with anger or longing, it simply stood still, thick and honest. Miriam didn't flinch. Her hands remained calm at her sides, and her face carried the expression of someone who had long since stopped asking questions. Harrison opened the gate slowly, and the creak of it startled a bird into flight. He walked toward her, not hurriedly, not confidently, but like a man unsure if he was walking into forgiveness or judgment. "Miriam," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. She didn't respond, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't owe a response to the name he had stopped saying with care a long time ago. He took another step forward. "I didn't think you'd come back." She tilted her head slightly as if the wind had spoken instead. He tried again, words tumbling out now like stones skipping over a lake, brief contact, no depth. "It happened after that fight in January. We were drifting, and I didn't know how to. You stopped talking to me, and I thought maybe we were both done." Her expression didn't change. She wasn't here for excuses, only clarity. "You brought her into the house," she said finally, and her voice was not cracked or shaky but clear, polished by months of reflection. He looked down, shame swimming in his eyes. "I didn't mean for her to replace you." She shook her head slowly. "She didn't. You just revealed that I had already been erased." A gust of wind caught her scarf then, lifting it slightly, and she let it fall over her shoulder without adjusting it. "When did you decide my silence meant I was gone?" The question didn't need an answer. It wasn't meant to be solved like a riddle. It was a mirror placed gently in front of him. Harrison took a step back. He looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of the life he could have had if he had known how to cherish it. Behind him, the girl's laughter continued, oblivious to the weight of the adult's silence. Miriam turned to go, but not with drama. Her exit was deliberate, gentle, like closing a book you finally understood. She heard his voice behind her one more time. "Miriam, is there any part of you that's still?" He didn't finish the sentence, maybe because he couldn't. Maybe because some words dissolved before they reached the lips. She didn't turn around. "There's a part of me that still prays for you," she said over her shoulder. "But that's not the same thing as waiting." Her feet moved over the same pavement that had once felt like home. Now it just felt like ground, solid, steady, unclaimed. He healeth the broken in heart and bindeth up their wounds. Psalm 147 verse 3. The verse drifted through her thoughts not as comfort but as confirmation. She had not come to reclaim anything. She had come to see for herself what she already knew. And in doing so, something inside her stood a little taller, like a candle deciding to burn brighter just because it could. The morning she packed the box felt no different from the mornings before it. Cool air, the scent of tea steeping beside her notebook, and the chirp of finches on the inn's windowsill. Yet something had shifted within her. Not loudly, not all at once, but like the slow thaw of frost on a stubborn stone. She laid each item in the small wooden box with a care that didn't come from some sentiment, but from respect for what each object had once meant. A photograph curled at the edges of her and Harrison standing beside the maroon Ford he'd inherited from his uncle. A smooth river stone they'd picked up during a hike their second year of marriage. Her wedding ring, simple gold with a faint scratch from when it had once snagged on an old fence nail. And finally a folded note written in her neat, scriptive hand that read, "I lived with you, but not beside you. That is no life at all." She wrapped the contents gently in brown paper and sealed the box with a piece of twine. No return address, no dramatic goodbye. She left it on the front desk of the inn with Dottie, who raised an eyebrow and said nothing, because some things a woman must do without commentary. That same afternoon, Miriam walked to the post office, her steps light, as if her bones had suddenly remembered they didn't have to carry what no longer belonged to her. She didn't wait for thanks or regret or any sort of reaction. The act of letting go was the point, not what followed. Miriam didn't return to the inn after that. She took the next train out of Edenridge and headed toward Ellerbank, a small village draped in the green hush of wide trees and the scent of loam and pine. The station platform was quiet, and she stepped down with the grace of someone arriving not for escape but for restoration. Her sister Ruth met her at the platform, her arms wrapped in a thick cardigan and her face half surprised, half relieved. Ruth had always kept the guest room ready, though she never said so out loud. Some women, especially those who've known hardship early, prepare for storms without needing to see clouds. The house in Ellerbank was smaller, lined with ivy and the memories of their childhood, painted jars in the kitchen, hand-stitched curtains, the low creak of the wooden swing out back. Ruth didn't ask what had happened, and Miriam didn't offer details. They sat on the porch that evening, sipping tea with lemon and honey, letting the cicadas fill the space between their silence. There is a kind of comfort only found in being known without having to be explained. That night Miriam slept with the window cracked open, and the air smelled like soil and hydrangeas, and for the first time in a long while, her dreams weren't stained with the color of loss. Days in Ellerbank moved like a river that had no need to rush. Miriam helped around the house, dusting forgotten corners and organizing the pantry with the precision of someone who found peace in order. She took morning walks on the forest path behind Ruth's home, pausing by the stream to watch the sunlight trickle through the trees like honey through fingers. She wasn't waiting for anything to happen. She wasn't hoping for someone to find her. The ache inside her had not vanished, but it had learned how to live without gasping. One afternoon, while browsing the village library, Miriam saw a notice pinned to the bulletin board. Volunteers needed. Girls writing circle, ages 9, 13. She didn't think twice before signing her name. The sessions were held every Friday in the church basement, and it was there she met the little ones with crooked teeth, awkward postures, and bright imaginations. They arrived with mismatched notebooks and stories about invisible creatures and long-lost grandmothers. Miriam taught them to find truth inside sentences, to say things with shape, with heart. One girl, Elsie, wrote a poem that ended with the line, "My mama says silence can be loud too if it sits on your chest." Miriam smiled when she read it, her throat tightening with something both sharp and sweet. Teaching these girls didn't heal her in any grand cinematic way. It simply reminded her that life continued, and in some corners of the world it still held beauty worth writing down. One evening, as the last of the summer light folded itself behind the hills, Miriam walked once more to the riverbank that bordered the edge of the village. The same river she and Ruth had splashed in as children, building makeshift boats from twigs and paper scraps. This time she carried a small paper boat folded from the torn page of one of her own journal entries. Inside it, she'd written a final prayer, not a plea, not a request, just a quiet acknowledgement. Thank you for walking me out of a place I would never have left on my own. She lit a small candle at its center and placed it gently on the water. The flame danced, defying the current before drifting into the darkness. She sat on the grass and watched until it disappeared. There were no words spoken, no need. The river had heard enough from her over the years. Her hands were no longer clenched. Her shoulders no longer drawn tight against invisible weight. When she rose, the stars were blinking through the trees like distant promises. She walked back slowly, letting the night wrap around her like a shawl. In her heart there was no revenge, no victory, just a deep, full stillness. Cast your bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 1. Miriam didn't know what might return to her, but she no longer needed to. What mattered was that she had let go, and the world, gentle, silent, and sacred, had made room for her again. A year passed quietly, the kind of year that left no footprints but shifted everything beneath the surface. Eden Ridge had not changed in the dramatic ways people expect when they're hoping for reinvention. The bakery still smelled of cinnamon by mid-morning. Children still darted across cobbled streets with sticky fingers and untied laces, and the chapel bells still rang a minute late on Sundays. But something had indeed changed, subtle, like a door being left ajar. Miriam Alden's name had softened into a hush in the mouths of those who once whispered it with sharpness. People didn't quite know what to make of her departure. Some said she had gone to care for a sick relative. Others said she had left her husband because of some young woman. No one was certain. Harrison himself never clarified the story. He returned to town errands alone, nodded politely to old neighbors, and kept his home quiet. Lydia was no longer seen with him. Word was she'd moved to Cartwright Hill with her daughter, leaving behind nothing but a few sunflower decals in the child's bedroom and a mug with her name that now sat unused in the cabinet. Harrison remained in the house, but not in the way he once had. The lights stayed off longer, the curtains drawn tighter, and the roses in the garden eventually withered for lack of pruning. Sometimes people waved at him and got no wave back. And so the town let his silence stay where it was. Some silences are easier to respect than the truths they threaten to reveal. Miriam, by contrast, had begun to rediscover the ease of breath. Ella Bank, with its gentle hills and willow-lined roads, became more than a place of retreat. It became her rhythm. She now lived in a small brick cottage on the edge of town, a short walk from the river and even shorter from Ruth's kitchen. The girls from her writing circle visited often, bringing poems on torn paper and questions about words with meanings too big for their years. She had a chair by the fireplace that squeaked when she leaned back, and a lemon tree outside her window that gave only one good fruit a year. But oh, what a lemon it was! Her days were simple, and not in the way people dismiss with pity. They were full of the kind of quiet moments that build a life without ceremony. A letter came in the mail once from Eden Ridge, the handwriting unmistakable, firm, square, confident. She recognized it before she even opened it. Inside was a short note. I never understood the weight of silence until yours left the house empty. It was signed H, no plea, no blame. Just the confession of a man finally hearing what he had refused to listen to. Miriam folded the letter slowly and placed it in the back of her journal. She didn't reply. There was nothing cruel in her silence. It was simply a boundary that needed no explanation. He that hath knowledge spareth his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. Proverbs 17 verse 27. Let the past speak only when necessary and only in whispers. The morning she visited Eden Ridge again, the sky was as clear as polished glass, and the breeze carried the smell of freshly turned soil. She hadn't planned to return, but grief, healing, and time often moved together in peculiar ways. Miriam didn't go to the house, nor the inn, nor even the bookstore. Instead, she stopped at the edge of the river just beyond the town, the same bend where she had once stood with a paper boat and an old prayer folded between her fingers. This time she brought nothing with her. She sat on the same rock she remembered, the one shaped like a cradle, and looked out over the slow-moving water. A fisherman stood further downstream, his line cast without expectation. A child chased dragonflies, her laughter like a chime in the wind. Miriam watched them all, then closed her eyes, not to escape but to anchor herself to the moment. She did not think of Harrison, not in bitterness, not in yearning. If he was a part of her thoughts, it was only as a figure drawn in chalk, faint, familiar, and no longer permanent. Her heart had not grown hard, only wise. The house she had once kept so carefully was no longer her sanctuary. Her sanctuary was this stillness. Her temple was made of breath, forgiveness, and space. The river spoke no great revelation to her. It simply moved, steady and unchanging, a reminder that some things flow whether we watch them or not. By the time she returned to her cottage that evening, the sky had melted into pinks and grays, and the first stars peered through the veil of dusk. Ruth had left a small pot of soup on the stove and a fresh loaf of bread on the table. There was no note. She didn't need one. Miriam poured a bowl, sat down by the window, and ate slowly, watching the world outside prepare for rest. That night, before sleep, she opened her journal for the last time. The pages were almost full. Near the back, where the ribbon marker had settled, she wrote, "I left not to punish, but to preserve what was left of me. I did not walk away with rage. I walked away with reverence, for the woman I still was beneath the ruins." She closed the book gently and placed it on her nightstand. The wind outside curled softly against the window, like a cat settling into its corner. She pulled the quilt over her legs and rested her hand against her chest, not to still her heartbeat, but to feel how steady it had become. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she shall laugh at the time to come. Proverbs 31 verse 25. There was no ending to this story, not the kind with applause or epilogue. Only the quiet truth that some lives begin again not with fire or fury, but with a single choice to walk away and never look back with longing. If you've ever loved deeply and been met with silence, if you've ever made a house a home, only be treated like a stranger in it. If you've ever walked away with your heart in pieces but your back straight, then this story is for you. Miriam didn't leave because she was weak. She didn't walk away because she had no fight in her. She walked away because sometimes preserving your peace is braver than proving your point. You don't have to raise your voice to be powerful. You don't have to break things to make a statement. Sometimes the softest goodbyes echo the loudest. Maybe you're still in your own quiet storm. Maybe you're holding on to a door that no longer opens for you. If so, hear this: you are not less holy for choosing peace over pain. You are not less faithful for refusing to stay where love no longer lives. Let this story remind you that healing doesn't always come in a blaze. It often arrives in silence, in morning tea, in fresh pages, in children's laughter, in walks by the river. Don't rush it, don't force it, let it find you. Now, let's pray. Father in heaven, we come before you tonight with hearts open and tender, carrying burdens we've hidden in the corners of our soul. Thank you for the quiet strength you place in the hearts of your daughters, and for the stillness that saves us when the noise of betrayal tries to break us. Lord, for every listener who has been hurt where they should have been held, I ask you to comfort them deeply. For every woman who gave her all and was met with neglect, wrap her in your mercy. For every man who feels lost and weary, give him the courage to return to truth. And for every soul that is tired of rebuilding what others keep breaking, may you become their safe place, their healer, their quiet companion. Teach us, O God, not just to leave what wounds us, but to find what restores us. Make us brave enough to walk away when staying costs us our peace, and wise enough to know when silence is the loudest sermon we can preach. Lord, rebuild what was torn down, not always with the same bricks, but with your grace, your timing, and your glory. Help us carry our heartbreaks not like chains, but like scars that testify I survived. I grew. I healed. Let your word be the lamp at our feet and the whisper in our hearts that says, you are worth more than this. And when we choose peace, when we choose quiet, when we choose ourselves without apology, remind us that you are still in the room. Thank you, Father, for never abandoning us, even when we walk through the valley without saying a word. Thank you for walking with us until we could walk on our own again. Thank you for healing us so gently we didn't even realize it had already begun. In the name of the one who sees all, restores all, and loves without condition, we say boldly Amen. Amen. we've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.